Okay, great. So thank you everybody for joining us today for our part 2 of our grant writing panel. Back in April, we held a grants panel, which was really focused on tips for writing grants. And we had a lot of questions during that session about where to look for funding and what funding opportunities are available. So today we have brought together another panel of presenters who will share some specific funding opportunities with you and provide you with some details about what those funders are looking for. These presenters have served as reviewers for these grants, so they sort of have the inside scoop on these funding opportunities. So I'm sure that they will have a lot of great information to share. Just to let you know that everybody is muted at this time. If you have a question throughout the session, you can pop it into the chat, and then we'll save all of the questions for the end of the session after all of our presenters have had an opportunity to present. So this way we can offer some time for lots of discussion at the end. So I'll just introduce really quickly our 3 presenters, and then we will get started. So our first presenter is Colle Ruiz. She's the Sunshine State Digital Network Coordinator. Since 2017, she has been working with institutions from around the state of Florida to help them share their digital cultural heritage collections to the Digital Public Library of America. She manages the day-to-day operations of the network, conducts outreach and training related to digital collections, copyright, and metadata creation. And she holds an IMLS from Florida State University. We're also joined by Katie McCormick. She is the Associate Dean of Libraries for Special Collections and Archives at the Florida State University. In this capacity, she manages the rare book, manuscript, and archival collections of FSU, as well as the Digital Library Center and the administrative home of the Sunshine State Digital Network. Florida State University's Heritage Museum and the Claude Pepper Museum are also a part of her management responsibilities. Ms. McCormick currently serves as a reviewer for the Council of Library and Information Resources Digitizing Hidden Collections, her 5th review cycle for the grant. Her professional interests include community engagement, copyright and intellectual property, digital access, preservation, audio and visual archiving, and teaching. And she holds an MLIS from Simmons College and an MA in English with a focus in Irish literature and culture from Boston College. Dorothy Frank is the Florida Electronic Library Administrator and also the coordinator of the Florida Division of Library and Information Services Statewide Digital Initiative. In the past, she's also served as the division's conservator and Library Services and Technology Act Coordinator for 10 years prior to becoming the Florida Electronic Library Administrator. So thank you to our speakers for joining us today. And without any further ado, we will get started with Colle.
Hi everyone. So I will be talking to you all today about the IMLS grants that are available for digitization in libraries. I have served as a reviewer in the past for digitization grants submitted to the Institute of Museum and Library Services. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that experience and what they're looking for in successful grants. So I'll start with the goals that IMLS has set out for themselves in their strategic plan. Their primary overarching name for their strategic plan is transforming communities. So the 3 main goals that they've outlined within that strategic plan are promoting lifelong learning, building capacity, and increasing public access. And of course, they do this for both museums and libraries through funding opportunities to increase all of these, to elevate all of these goals. So to find IMLS grants that are available, I've outlined some websites down here. Notices for funding opportunities are usually made available approximately 30 to 90 days before the grants are due. So until the most current grant is made available, they do have applications and guidelines available from previous application years so that you can use those as a reference before the proper funding opportunity becomes announced. But keep in mind that while those are available for your reference, you must use the current fiscal year application when you apply for the grant. So the first place to look for the notices is the first link. The second link takes you to grants that are currently open for applications. The third link here lists all of the grants offered by IMLS to libraries and museums. And the fourth link allows you to search awarded grants and will provide a brief overview of each project. And in some cases, for some of the grants, they also provide the full successful grant application for those grants. And that's usually for the major ones like the library leadership grants. So grant funds for each type of grant will vary from year to year, and the number of grants is not always consistent. Depending on the number of accepted applications, how much each accepted application is awarded, and the total amount available for that particular grant for that year. Just as an FYI, IMLS is offering a pre-application webinar tomorrow to learn more and ask questions about the Laura Bush 21st Century Librarian Program and the National Leadership Grant for Libraries. And that's tomorrow at 3 o'clock. So you can join and view on-demand webinars at the final link on this page. So that information is available there. So when you find a grant, so this is an example of the Accelerating Promising Practices for Small Libraries grant, which does have a component where you can propose projects for digitization. This is an example of the page that you land on when you click on the opportunity, the announcement for funding opportunity. And this page will provide you a brief overview of the grant program. It also gives you program contacts that you can reach out to for different types of grant proposals. So they have, for this one, community memory, digital inclusion, and school libraries. So they have outlined the staff members at IMLS there at the bottom that would have the best expertise to help answer questions about the grant or review your grant proposal before you submit it. And it tells you the total funding available for each grant and how long the grant period is for. So for example, if you submitted a grant for $10,000, the amount of time that you would have for that project or proposal would be 2 years from the point of award. It also tells you if there's any cost share required, and there's a link at the top of the page that will take you to a more detailed proposal or a document for the notice of funding. So these documents generally are over 40 pages long. Some of them are over 50 pages long, again, depending on which grant you're applying for. This particular document for this grant is about 47 or 48 pages long. So they are very detailed and they have a lot of information, but the first page that isn't the table of contents will include the due dates and timelines for review. So the timelines for review will also vary depending on which grant you're applying for. So you'll want to pay attention to that because it'll give you information about when you'll receive notice if you've gotten the grant. If it's a two-step review process, it'll have those dates in there as well. Some of the grants go through two-step review. Some of them go through a one-step peer review. So that information will be available on the second page after the table of contents. So this is a lot of the really relevant information that you need to know right off of the bat. This page very often will also include a total amount for the total amount of money that they have for all of the grants. So not just what they can grant, what the maximum grant amount for each institution would be, but the total amount available. This is why it also says in a lot of the grants that the number of grants that they award is really dependent on how much each grant that has been awarded asked for. So it can vary depending on how much each person or each organization has asked for their projects, how many grants get awarded during that cycle. So the different parts of this document, once you've clicked on that PDF, there are a lot of parts. Like I said, they're very lengthy documents. They're about, can be about 50 pages long. The first section will be the program description, which will include indicators of successful projects, funding categories such as planning, national forums, projects, and research grants. And then it will also include project categories, and these will include things like lifelong learning, community memory, community catalysts, and national digital infrastructure and initiatives. So there's a differentiation between the funding categories and the project categories. The funding categories are overall like what kind of grant you're submitting, whether that's to plan, to either host a national forum, if it's project-based or if it's research-based funding that you're looking for. And then the project categories will be more specific information related to the content of your project or forum or whatever you're putting on or requesting funding for. So Section A will list that. Section B will tell you how much is available for each type of award correlated to the funding category. So again, those funding categories are planning, national forum, projects, and research. And oftentimes the grants will have different dollar amounts that they can, like maximum dollar amounts that they will provide for each one of those categories. So Section B will outline that. It will also outline the total amount available for all awards for that particular grant cycle. And it will also provide a performance timeline. Section C will include the types of organizations that are eligible for that particular type of grant. So it'll stipulate things like type of organization, potentially the location, or the size of the organization that is eligible for that type of grant. So the grant that I showed you as an example earlier is specifically for small libraries. So it stipulates either staff size or budget as a requirement for that type of grant. So your organization can't exceed that eligibility requirement. Section C will also stipulate any cost sharing requirements correlated with the funding categories. Section D provides you with the most up-to-date document requirements for that application cycle. So as I said before, they have all of the funding opportunities available for review, but you'll want to make sure that you're using the most current funding opportunities so that you have, particularly for Section D, for the most up-to-date document requirements for that cycle. It will also include instructions for completing each document, formatting requirements, and questions to consider when preparing each portion of your application. So it does provide some guiding questions to help you think about the content of your proposal. Section E goes over the information for that particular, goes over the application review information for that particular grant. As I said before, some grants go through a single peer review step before going to the director for selection. Others go through a two-step peer review process before going to the director for selection. And Section E will tell you which type of review this particular grant will be going through. Section F goes over reporting and administrative information. So this section is very relevant. Should you be awarded the money that you've requested through your proposal? And then the remaining sections are just additional information and appendices that might have more specific instructions for documents and formatting. So while these documents are very long, you should definitely take the time to read the entire notice of funding. However, I have bolded some sections here, which are the ones that you will most likely refer back to the most when completing your application. Section D will certainly be utilized, probably the most of all of them, along with the appendices that will guide you on how to complete your application materials. So these are the different parts of the notice of funding. Once you have completed, I highly recommend having working documents in order to complete and work together with your collaborators to work on your proposal. But once you've completed and you have all your information gathered, complete grant applications are all submitted to grants.gov. So they use that central grant application software for all of the government grants that get submitted. So that's where you'll submit your final application. I highly encourage you to have your proposal reviewed before you submit it. And IMLS staff, like listed on that contacts section, is there waiting and ready to review any proposals before the deadlines, so that they can provide feedback to you before you submit your final version. So again, the grants, depending on the grant that you're doing, it might go through a single peer review process or a double two-step peer review process. But a lot of the same questions are considered regardless of whether you're doing the single step or two-step peer review. And these questions that reviewers are looking for are: how well does the proposal address the indicators of successful projects? And again, that is listed in the funding opportunity announcement under section B. So another thing to consider that reviewers are considering is what components are or are not in place to ensure successful implementation of the proposed project. What recommendations do you have for improving the proposal? So reviewers will always provide feedback on your proposal, whether it is accepted or not. So you will get that feedback back from the proposal, from the reviewers, so that you can either make adjustments for the next grant cycle, or so that you're aware of potential weaknesses or strengths of your application. And then one of the other things that reviewers will very often consider are the topic project category selections, the amount of funds requested, if those are appropriate, and the scope of the potential impact of the project. And again, these are questions that are considered whether this is single or two-step peer review. And for some of the higher dollar amount grants, they'll also consider things like national impact, current significance, strategic collaborations, demonstrated expertise, and in some cases, diversity and equity and inclusion. Things like strategic collaborations and demonstrated expertise are also things that are considered for some of those smaller grants. So there are a lot of similar questions that get asked, whether it is a single step or two-step peer review. And the peers that review your grants generally have some sort of expertise in the project areas that you're submitting. So they might have expertise in school libraries or digitization projects or things like that. So like I said, in my experience, I have reviewed digitization grants because that is my area of where I have the most knowledge to be able to determine, to answer some of these questions that reviewers are asked to consider. So what are reviewers looking for when they're looking at grant proposals that have been submitted. These are things that I'm particularly looking for, but there are also a lot of guiding questions that IMLS provides to reviewers to consider. So things that I look for are knowledge of best practices and expertise and experience. So whether or not someone has a background in that area of the project they're proposing, and if the primary investigators do not, have they involved people that have that knowledge and experience that can help guide them through their project. We also consider alignment with project categories and agency goals. So you really want to make sure that you're trying to tie the agency goals to your project. How are these things increasing access, building capacity, or promoting lifelong learning? You want to make sure that you're tying those to the main goals of the agency, but also aligning them with the project categories. And in that opportunity for funding document, each product category will have a description underneath it that provides guidance for what they're looking for under those projects, what kinds of projects they're looking to fund or would be good candidates for that particular type of funding or for that particular grant. So you really want to go back to those documents and ensure that your project is lining up with those things that have been outlined in those documentation. You also want to clearly articulate realistic goals, realistic measures of success, and reporting methods. So you want to make sure that you've thought your project through all the way to the end, and how you're going to report and what measures you're going to be looking at to ensure that your goals have been met. And again, excuse me, you want to make sure that you're tying those back, aligning those to the agency goals as well. So, and you want to make sure that they're realistic. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about sustainability as well. So, feasibility of the project, given the outlined time, financial equipment, and personnel resources is something else we consider as a whole. So you are going to be submitting a lot of budget documentation and personnel documentation. Resumes and letters of support are oftentimes part of application materials that you're submitting. So ensuring that everything as a whole, as outlined in your proposal, makes the project feasible given the amount of time that you have. So some funding periods are 1 year, some funding periods are 2 years or more, depending on the project and the amount of money that you've been given. So you want to make sure that your goals actually fit within the outlined parameters that you've put in there. I have seen some grants that really are not feasible within the amount of time or the number of staff that they have. So you really want to make sure that you're actually dedicating enough hours and resources to the project that you're outlining. And provide as much detail as you can in your proposal about what that looks like so that the reviewer doesn't have to guess or make assumptions about, and they don't have to fill in the gaps in your proposal. So detail and background information is extremely important in your proposal. We also look for collaborations with stakeholders and partner organizations. So one of the questions that we consider is whether or not you have identified staff partners and consultants or service providers who possess the experience and skills necessary to complete the work successfully. So partnerships are particularly fondly looked upon because very often that can help if there's an in-kind contribution that needs to be made with staff time. It's helpful if you're enlisting partners that have additional resources, like potentially like equipment or infrastructure that you can capitalize on, so that kind of stretches the amount that you're seeking. And we're also wondering if you've involved the beneficiaries of the project in the planning of the project. So if your stakeholders that you're applying for the grant for are students or members of your community, have you involved them in the planning? Have you asked them what their needs are and what they would like the service to look like that you're proposing? And if they will find it useful. So if you're involving them in the design or the planning of your proposal, so that you, and that's a really important part, because you want to make sure that you're not proposing something that no one's going to use, right? So involving them in the planning and including that information in your proposal on how you've done that and potentially some of the feedback that you've received is very useful to the reviewers, and it strengthens your application a lot. And finally, we want to make sure that the sustainability of the project beyond the funding period is outlined in your proposal. So, for example, if you are planning to digitize materials and have them somewhere available online, how are you planning to maintain that infrastructure? Are you hosting that through a partner or a vendor? And if so, how do you plan to sustain the access to that beyond the funding period? So we also want to see a commitment to this project beyond the amount of money that you're getting. Are you going to continue offering programming? How are you incorporating this work past your funding period? And is there administrative support or other support within your community or organization to ensure that this work continues and that access doesn't get lost or things like that? So sustainability is also a very important part of the process. So I've seen projects proposed where they're going to digitize something. It's going to be available in a closed system on one computer in a library. That really doesn't increase access very much. Or it's a system, they select a system that isn't necessarily designed for public access. So providing feedback to people about potential systems they can consider, potential ways they can look at designing their metadata, or partners they can collaborate with, is a lot of feedback that we can provide as reviewers. But really thinking about these things ahead of time and doing your research will help make for a very strong proposal when we're reviewing. We really don't want to have to reach to try to fill in gaps. So detail is really, really important. So some lessons from unfunded grant applications. Change my slide here. Okay. So you want to make sure that you review reviewer comments and use them to build a stronger proposal to submit at the next cycle. So don't be discouraged if your application doesn't get funded. You will get those reviewer comments, and you should be using those to strengthen your next application. Try again. You want to make sure that you're building relationships with organizations or professionals with expertise in the project focus area. So look for members, organizations within your community or region, or even nationally, that you know have expertise in these areas. I think as librarians, we're very happy to share our expertise and help each other out, because our ultimate goal is to help the public. So we are happy to help each other. So definitely seek out those partnerships and build those relationships. Those will help strengthen your proposal in the future as well. Plan ahead. I've seen instances, I've consulted with groups in the past that have just started too late, have started their planning process too late. So not only does gathering all of the materials for your proposal take a lot of time and preparation and collaboration, things like letters of support, determining budgets and timelines is extremely time consuming and requires a lot of planning. But sometimes learning how to use the submission system can be a learning curve for a lot of people and can take a lot of time. So you definitely don't want to wait until the last minute to submit your application or to seek feedback on your application. Like I said, the IMLS staff is there and ready to help make your application as strong as possible. They will review it and provide feedback. So the sooner that you have things ready, the more time you have to make changes and have people look it over, and to learn how to use the system to submit the grant documentation. So those are some of the tips that I have, and I'll be happy to answer more specific questions at the end. But I will pass it on to Katie McCormick now.
Thank you, Kayla, and thank you to Jill, Alvin, Portia, and other organizers of this webinar and the series as a whole. Thanks for the opportunity to share some of my own experiences as a reviewer. Let me make sure I'm in the right, yeah, there we go. You've all heard my introduction. I'm Katie McCormick. I work here at Florida State University Libraries. My perspectives in relationship to grants, and certainly the thing I'll be talking about most is my perspective as a member of the Council for Library and Information Services Digitizing Hidden Collections grant review. I've been doing those grant reviews since 2016. One of the things that distinguishes the CLIR grant review process from some others, in addition to being privately funded, not federally funded or state funded, the CLIR makes an effort to ask panelists to return, and we meet in person twice a year. So this is a different process than some of the other panels I've been on. I have also reviewed digitization grants for the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, and started grant reviewing as a member of the Advisory Council for the North Carolina Exploring Cultural Heritage Online, what was once known as NC ECHO. They had specific digitization grants in North Carolina out of the LSTA program. So while I'm speaking most directly to my experiences as a grant reviewer for digitizing hidden collections, I can observe, and after having listened to Kayla and thinking about other experiences, that there's certainly aspects of applying for grants that are almost universal in the process. And then there are some distinguishing characteristics for the organizational and unique opportunities that governmental and private entities provide, and paying attention to the language of grant applications is really important to help figure out how to match those things. I suppose to be transparent, sort of where ideas come from, certainly while I'll be speaking primarily from my experiences as a grant reviewer, I have also been a partner on several grants. I have been a grant applicant, successful and non-successful, and as Associate Dean for Special Collections in FSU Libraries. I'm an administrator, and so I'm often thinking about money and how to make things happen. And so as I approach grants as a reviewer, and as I think about reflecting on successes and failures that I've seen in the process, those are some of the spaces that my perspective comes from. So the Council of Library and Information Resources, as an organization, they are non-governmental, they're privately funded. The Andrew W. Mellon Foundation provides support for CLIR. The Digital Library Federation is a part of CLIR. And the Digitizing Hidden Collections grant program is one of their grant programs. This program evolved out of an earlier grant program that provided money. It was just the Hidden Collections grant program, and it provided grantees the opportunity to process, catalog, describe ostensibly hidden archival and special collections materials. When that program sunsetted or was in the last phase of its funding, it evolved into a new program, Digitizing Hidden Collections, out of recognition that many of the earlier grants, that the desire to digitize special collections and archival materials and to utilize online environments and digitization to help unhide important material and collections, that was something that grantees and institutions and organizations were seeking more. So the evolution of the program reflects changing needs across the country, and I think also the evolving importance of having materials, not just information about materials, accessible online. The Digitizing Hidden Collections program, since its inception, has awarded around $4 million each year. This year, I just finished my first round of reviews because of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. The application deadlines had been extended, and so our reviewing cycle is not what it is normally. Typically, we're reviewing first round in June, second round in November, with decisions delivered in January and beginning of funding. This year, because of our due date, our initial due date was right in the midst of many organizations needing to shut down. The application deadline was switched. We are doing our first round of reviews as a committee this week, on Thursday and Friday, and then our second round review will be in January, with notices to go out shortly after. This year is also unusual, I think, in that the Mellon funding for this program, this is the last year of this particular programmatic structure. CLIR is currently in the process of reviewing the program, resubmitting an ask to Mellon. As a reviewer and as a person, I'm very hopeful that Mellon will continue to fund this and or a very similar initiative through CLIR, but some of the parameters that I'm talking about in the process may change slightly in next year. So I think it's something to keep an eye out for, and there'll be additional information as the year comes through. Again, I'd also like to say, as I talk about CLIR and digitizing hidden collections, I will put a encouraging word into connect to program staff. My perspectives come as a reviewer, not as someone who works for the organization or who is managing all programmatic aspects. But I think knowing how reviewers view things can also be really helpful. So in CLIR's Digitizing Hidden Collections process, there are 2 rounds of review. There's the initial application. One of the things that differs from CLIR's grant process, from IMLS, from NHPRC and NEH and some others, is that the initial round is actually, applicants are submitting almost the entire application, and it is a long application. So that the labor intensiveness of the first phase can often be discouraging to individuals and organizations. It's not a summary report. You really are being asked for numerous details, and we recognize the labor intensiveness of that process and where that labor intensiveness may be a barrier for some organizations. So I mentioned that because as they're reviewing the program, that may be one of the things that in the future changes slightly. I will say, as a reviewer and in recognition of the labor intensiveness of the application process itself, it is actually very helpful to get almost the full suite of information. So the things that were missing in the first part of the process, applicants are not required to have their letters of support. It's acknowledged that they may not have been able to choose the vendor that they want to work with, if they're wanting to work with a vendor. And certainly in this year, there's a recognition that samples from collections, examples of work previously done, or some of the other supplemental material may be more difficult to include in the first round of applications because many of our applicants were not working on site due to the pandemic. But the comprehensiveness of the first round really allows for the review committee to provide, I think, more meaningful feedback. So one of the goals on the part of the first round reviewers is really taking into consideration and reflecting on how an application meets the overall criteria and whether or not it is designed well enough, has sustainability plans and other things, details I'll talk about in a moment, where it could be successful coming through the second round of review. So I think it's important to note in the first round, while we are certainly looking at potential fundability, to the potentials for success of a project, the first round is not a decision on what will get funded or not. It is giving all applicants a comprehensive review to know whether or not in the full pool, the application, whether organizations are ready for the second round. So that the possible next steps between first and second rounds are that move to the second round review. In the instance that in past years when the program has been continuing, often applicants are invited to reapply at a different time. When that happens, it's often because the project is really important, has the potential to be quite successful, but there are significant intellectual property, technical or project plan design concerns that reviewers and the committee as a whole feel like will take an organization longer than the period between receiving comments and needing to resubmit revisions. And so that's often when people are invited to rethink, pull more details, and reapply at another time. There are also instances when organizations and applicants don't make it into the second round and their projects are not invited to return. They still receive what we all hope as reviewers and program staff is meaningful feedback, so that they may be able to learn, redesign, apply for different and in some cases more appropriate grant opportunities. Often if an organization is not invited back, it is rooted in a disconnect between the application and the core purposes of CLIR Digitizing Hidden Collections program. It could also be that in the initial grant application, not only are the revisions and corrections and updates to that application seem beyond the scope of the time in this first round, but that it is occasionally quite clear from applications that organizations or the individuals submitting the grant on the part of an organization aren't ready for the grant. And in that means that the infrastructure is not there. There's a deep lack of understanding of technical or project planning. I think an example of that I see at least once, if not more, every grant cycle, particularly happens in academia, where an individual faculty member is proposing a digitization project in collections, and it is clear from the application that there has been no conversation or communication with the entity on campus who manages that collection. And there's a distinct disconnect between the goals of the project and what is actually feasible when you haven't discussed the project. So those are 3 scenarios in the first review cycle. When it comes to the review panel, CLIR program officers, we are assigned, multiple reviewers are assigned to each grant. I mentioned that one of the things that sometimes distinguishes CLIR from other grant programs is that their review panels, we are appointed, and many of us continue as long as we can. Some folks roll off because of other commitments. I can say in the 6-7 years I've been on the panel, the review committee is a very diverse group of individuals, both in their backgrounds, also regions of the country they're representing, the types of organizations they represent, and also diverse in the perspectives that they bring to the table based on their areas of expertise. So that the CLIR review panels are made up of practitioners like myself, technical advisors, intellectual property advisors. So there's at least one lawyer who deals in intellectual property on the review panel. This year we actually have 2 who are reviewing applications, scholars from a variety of fields, so that as we're reviewing, applicants in the feedback that they get from reviewers aren't only receiving comment on one aspect of the grant. We're really trying to think about it holistically and provide feedback. Additionally, in the last couple of years, in instances where the review panel as a whole has felt as though certain applicants were not given the same level of technical reviews, so that, by the numbers, it's maybe not always possible that the handful of us, or the 2 or 3 of us who have technical perspectives and experience, can't feasibly comment on all. I think this year we had 150 applications, but we can flag in discussion or now in the system when we think grants need additional feedback on budget, on sustainability, on digital preservation, and several of us have agreed to do additional readings when we need to. And I mentioned that both in terms of explanation of process, but I think it's also important to note that as grantees, that your reviewers are doing their best to be able to provide meaningful feedback. And at least in my experiences on this review panel and on others that have actually met, I have never experienced conversations that didn't try to meaningfully engage in growth and development, and providing good feedback to applicants, regardless of whether their grant application was initially successful. In second round reviews, so program staff do amazing work. They do a lot of work. We not only do they collate our comments and our sort of internal committee rankings, and then help us corral in-person conversation, and this year for the first time Zoom conversation and reviews, where we look at between all 3 reviewers. Sometimes we're all in agreement, sometimes we're not. We're given an opportunity to talk with each other about our perspectives on applications, highlight questions and concerns we have, advocate for strengths in proposal, and negotiate together to come up with a final list of what moves into the second round. And program staff do an amazing job of collating information, keeping us organized, and being sure that we're approaching our reviews, our conversations, and our eventual judgments in fair ways. So one of the things that program staff does for us as reviewers and for the meeting is they provide us with an initial overview of all of the applications, the geographical distribution, the types of organizations that have applied, when there are collaborations, trying to illuminate what kind of organizations are involved in the collaborations, so that while as reviewers we're quite familiar with our small set, we get to see a large picture and understand or begin to build understanding of what the impact of the distribution of this $4 million could be. When we get to second round reviews, program staff has taken everything we've written. Often they're taking additional notes in our meeting to add to comments and feedback that program applicants or grant applicants are provided. They work with individual applicant institutions to be sure they're getting the information they need. Then grant applicants have an opportunity to review feedback they've been given, to complete the overall application with the additions of letters of support, vendor quotes, other information that completes the package, and are also given the opportunity to respond to or reconsider their application content in the context of reviewer feedback. Grants are then, the updated grants are then resubmitted. Program staff then redistributes for the second round review. Often in second round review, we are reviewing the same applications. This is of course not universally true, because in the first round, we often, I think, go from somewhere between 100 and 150 applications. In the second round, what we're working to review are somewhere between 40 and 60, excuse me, depending on how much money is being asked for and the nature of the applicant round or the applicant pool in any given year. So sometimes as reviewers, we get to see applications that we had reviewed in the first round. Sometimes we're seeing those in addition to doing new reviews. And that balance helps provide both feedback on changes or updates that might have been asked for, or additional information that might have been asked for, but also helping to ensure that new perspectives come into the reading of the grant, again, to help make final decisions, but also to continue to provide meaningful feedback, so that anyone who doesn't get awarded after the second round can still be provided with information and feedback that would help strengthen that application for the next year's round, or that might be useful really in reforming a grant, a CLIR grant for a grant given by another institution. In the second round, what we're often looking most deeply at is one, whether applicants have acknowledged and or addressed comments from the first round. We're taking a deeper dive into the viability and sustainability of projects as outlined in the final proposal. So sometimes the feedback that people get in that first round is really asking them to better explain, add more detail to, or potentially revise their sustainability plans, the project plan or the technical infrastructure plan. And many times we see significant updates to that information. So really thinking about viability and sustainability if the project were funded. We are often, as a committee as a whole, I would say, looking at outreach plans diversity, equity, and inclusion statements and plans for how outreach can help achieve connecting diverse communities to collections. We are looking deeply at budget and especially around labor costs. I think the CLIR grant review panel, we see applications from so many different kinds of organizations, and we understand the need, the variant budget needs based on project, but also the kinds of organizations and the resources of any given organization. But we are also doing our best to consider fair market value for labor, to think about when we see differences between grant funding to support already a staff that's already full-time in an organization, and then lesser budget figures to bring on new hires in contingent labor situations. We will often ask questions about that both in the first round and then do a deeper review of that in the second round. Again, acknowledging that each organization is in a different situation and you can't make assumptions, but we can make recommendations. And we have seen, I think, some examples of what I would personally classify as some pretty egregious budget information where the permanent full-time staff member, their salary is being offset almost 100%, and part-time people who are being brought in are barely being paid minimum wage in major and very expensive cities. And so just trying to really look at labor costs. I can say too, between the first and second round, I know I have read grants where I've actually, in my comments, suggested to applicants to reconsider their budgets, sometimes to ask for more money because it would be fair and within the limits of the grant parameters, but also sort of trying to provide occasionally concrete feedback that gives applicants a way to review their budgets and their budget narratives to counterbalance the needs for equipment and other things with equitable costs in labor. And I'm not alone in that on the review panel. We're often looking deeper at copyright. Very appreciative to have an intellectual property lawyer on the committee who can advise and also offer comment and feedback when it comes to copyright and intellectual property. And looking deeply also at technical infrastructure. And it is not always the case that a grant won't get funded if reviewers have concerns about any one of these areas. We often think in terms of capacity building, so that in wanting and needing to award this funding to a diverse range of organizations, we have meaningful conversation and try to provide meaningful feedback and reflection on the fact that, as an example, a large, well-funded academic institution has a different structure and a different infrastructure than a small, independent museum or historical society. And that is not necessarily the base of judgment for which institution will be successful in the execution of their project, nor is that the final judgment on who has the material that needs to be digitized the most with grant funding. So it's definitely not that you have to have the perfect infrastructure, but you will likely get comment and feedback on potential improvements that can be made within the cost of the grant. Another thing we're especially looking at within collaborative grants, and I should have said in the beginning, so in Digitizing Hidden Collections, an individual institution can apply for grants up to $250,000 for 2 years of work, or collaborations for $500,000 for 3 years of work. one of the major questions that comes up when institutions or applicants are pursuing collaborative grants is it actually a collaboration? Or is it simply a listing of additional names to double the amount of the grant funding, as well as increase the length of the project time? And CLIR, as an organization and as a review panel, is really, when we see collaborations listed, we want to do our best to ensure that those are equitable collaborations and truly collaborations, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So I've touched on some of these things already. As a reviewer, I can say granting agencies and funders want to give out this money. There is a desire, the needs are recognized. We want to get money, or the organizations want to get money to people and groups who need it. Reviewers as a whole, we want to give out the money. This is why we've agreed to lend our perspectives, our knowledge, and our expertise to a review process. It's not to say no to people, it's to say yes. But grants are, and always have been, competitive. I think grant cycles are increasingly competitive as state and local funding are diminished, as organizations face financial issues, also expectations and needs to share information in different ways. We're seeing more and more applications. We're doing our best to evaluate those applications. And again, we're limited with the amount of money we can give away. So we really have to consider the potential for success, potential impact, and as I've mentioned, and Kayla mentioned in the framework of IMLS, thinking about how the investment of grant dollars in a project leads to sustainable projects that truly can be connected to, or are connected to communities beyond just the single institution or the grouping of institution or those communities who are asking for the money. Some suggestions: plan early. And this means even before you know which grant you might want to pursue. I would encourage folks and organizations to think about the work that they want to get done, the collections that their users want access to most, to projects that are happening throughout the state or across the country, to topical areas. What is it that you have? What is it that you can share? How do you prioritize that? And then look for the grants that help fund that. And when you find grants or are considering this process, look at the applications even the year ahead of time. Applications do change sometimes year to year, and in the midst of program change, you might see some significant updates to an application process. But you can garner a lot of helpful information by reading previous application processes, looking through sample applications from successful grantees, connecting your ideas to grant goals, starting conversations with potential partners early, asking questions, right? Invest your time and labor in this process. You know, not all organizations have a person who helps support writing grants, or in some cases an office who helps do that. So balance the labor intensity of this, but where you find a need, go for it. you may find that you are getting valuable feedback even if you don't get the grant to begin with, and that will eventually lead to additional funding. When we talk about grants that aren't successful, I mentioned the areas that we look at. If there are too many copyright questions, it can't move forward. I think increasingly in our conversations on the Digitizing Hidden Collections panel, we spend a fair amount of time examining and talking about and taking seriously the notion of connectedness, comprehensiveness, and diversity and inclusion. And so where grantees or grant applicants have been provided information and feedback on their outreach plan, questions about connecting to communities or roles of their partners, and don't respond to that or make changes in the second round, those are often grants that are not successful. We want to know that in funding digitization of materials, that those materials are reaching as many communities as possible. If they are materials that you want to digitize that represent or are from historically marginalized communities, and there's questions of colonization and practice and other things. Reviewers want to know that you as a primary investigator on the grant and your organization take seriously and have plans for your commitment to share that digitized material beyond your own small group of students or small community. Not all projects warrant that, but it is definitely something we consider. I'm going to flash up my last slide here, and this is mostly a list of resources, and I'll end with two thoughts. One, in terms of the resources, please do go to these. The Digitizing Hidden Collections applicant resources. I've listed several videos that were produced a couple of years ago. And again, I think it's most relevant to the Digitizing Hidden Collections process, but I think you might find it useful beyond that. And these are videos from reviewers with their perspectives. My last thought is, when it comes to collaborative grants, the most successful grants I've seen funded are ones where it's not just collections partners. It is organizations that have had meaningful conversations with educators, with community groups, and really support each other by bringing to a project their areas of expertise and knowledge. And that true collaboration is not about one organization driving all decisions and doing all of the work, but about each organization and individuals bringing together not just material, but perspective and expertise to contribute to the success of a project. So thank you. I'll turn it over to Dolly, and I look forward to your questions.
I'm Dorothy Frank, and I am from the Division of Library and Information Services. So we had originally started to talk about the Library Services and Technology Act, but one of the things that I also want to mention that has just come open is the CARES Act. So I will talk about LSTA, the Library Services and Technology Act. And the CARES Act has a lot of things that are very similar to the LSTA Act. application. But the reason I want to bring up the DLIS Florida CARES Act is that it is open right now, and the applications are due on August 17th. The CARES Act itself is used for the prevention of, preparation for, and response to coronavirus, including to expand digital network access, purchase internet accessible devices, and provide technical and support services. And some of the things that we are discovering are being used quite a lot right now during this particular interesting time that we're living in is digitized resources and online resources. And so digitization grants are definitely ones that will be considered for funding during the CARES Act, for the CARES Act applications. And so I wanted to mention, so the application deadline again is on August 17th. You can apply for the CARES Act on our DOS grant system, which is the same as all of our other grants. And so some of that I'll talk about in just a minute. So for LSTA and for the CARES Act, the eligible entities are public, academic, and special libraries, also school libraries, usually in partnership with a public library, and the multi-type library cooperatives, specifically for LSTA. For CARES Act, we have also expanded to include museums will be eligible entities as long as they have a library. So a library at a museum, special library, that kind of thing, are eligible entities. Now the Library Services and Technology Act grant itself is funded by IMLS, and it is a one-year program. We do require match for the LSTA grant. We will not be requiring match for the CARES Act grants. If the funding program is over $10,000 for the LSTA, you need to provide 1/3 match, but that can be in kind, which means salaries are absolutely used for matching. If you've got supplies that you buy, usually you're being used on the grant, you can use that as well, that sort of thing. Rural Economic Development Initiative and Rural Economic Opportunity Counties and municipalities, so READY and RAO, do not need to provide match for either LSTA or CARES, and no one needs to provide match for CARES. One of the reasons why I didn't make slides for CARES is because I made these slides up before we actually went live, and I didn't know when we were going live for the CARES Act. So, so the application cycle for both of these, there will be on the DOS grants system, dosgrants.com. LST applications open in January and they're due in March. CARES Act, they're open now, they're due in August. Both the CARES Act and LSTA will be reviewed by the State Library Council for funding. The recommendations for LSTA will be mid-June of next year. But the CARES Act applications will be reviewed, and I believe recommendations for funding will be in either the end of August or in September. We're still, I'm not sure of the timing for that yet, because we're in the middle of it right now. So in both cases, the council is the State Library Council, and they are made up of a group of volunteers from around the state who have various different backgrounds, very much like what Katie was describing earlier on the CLIR. She talked a little bit about what they looked for. It's very much the same. Caleb talked about what they look for. It's very much the same. So a lot of what both Katie and Kayla said are what our State Library Council looks for. They really want to see what kind of impact the funding will make. They want to see how feasible the project is. They want to see, you know, and when we talk about that, that means, you know, do you have the equipment? Do you have the knowledge? Do you have the capacity to carry out the project? Is it a little bit big? Is it a very ambitious project? Do you have enough staff to be able to accomplish it? And so it's a balance, like, because they want to see a lot of impact, but they also want to make sure it's feasible, so that they very much look for that balance. And then they want to know whether it is needed by the community, requested by the community, or a vital part of providing services to the community. And so again, going back to what Katie and Kayla had said, are these things that are being requested? Is this something that the community might need? So in a lot of cases, that's one of the very first things that the council will look for is what are the needs that are going to be addressed? And we even have a rubric that has these questions. What need is it going to address? Will it successfully address the need? Will it accomplish the goals that it's going to accomplish? Like, will all of the activities do what the community needs to have done? So we're going to talk a little about the funded digitization projects that we have done, and this is going to be similar to the CARES Act in some ways. So local newspapers, Moat Marine Lab, these were locally produced newspapers in a very vital community. Researchers have been asking for them. The grant application talked a lot about what was in these papers, who's looking for what, how the researchers are using the newspapers, and a reason that they needed to be digitized was because they were starting to get worn out by the researchers coming in. With the Moat Marine Lab, again, this was research that was from the early 20th century. It showed the state of the Gulf Coast around the Panhandle and down into the central part of Florida. Researchers doing amazing work on the grasslands, on the marine biology, on the salinity of the water, what was growing, what wasn't growing, all kinds of things from the early 20th century. And there were researchers from all over the world asking to see these handwritten notes and these reports that the Moat Marine has. And so this was something that they could show that there was a lot of demand for, and the sort of impact that researchers now could have from being able to access these items that the Moat Marine digitized. So this is one of the reasons, like, these are the two funded digitization projects that did a real good job of saying what the needs were and why they were important and why we should digitize them. LSTA digitization projects that haven't been funded, for example, was a series of sheet musics for orchestra with handwritten notes. Might have been really very interesting, but it didn't show it as like a vital need that the community had to have. It was sort of a nice to have. It was sort of an icing on the cake. And as one of the reviewers said, people need the vegetables and the meat. We don't have the money for icing, so we just can't fund it. And then one of the things that Katie talked a lot about was copyright. And folks are saying, well, we've got all these newspapers that are crumbling in our collection, and they're the New York Times or the St. Pete Times, or other newspapers that have been around for a good long time, but may not necessarily have copyright. That they would be allowed to digitize the newspapers, or they couldn't get permission to do the newspapers. And they also probably had microfilm or other types of access points. So the LSTA council chose not to fund newspaper digitization when it was more generic and there was a chance there was access other places. So if you come into either the CARES Act or the LSTA Act and you're not funded, again, just like Katie and Kayla were talking about, read the notes, listen to the recording of the meeting. They are going to give amazing feedback, and we'll have all sorts of points that would make the project stronger, provides all the details on why a project wasn't funded. And they always, in fact, our council member usually say, oh, hey, this is a project that we read last year. They've looked at all of our things. They've addressed all these points, and they've really improved their applications. And so I highly encourage folks to try again the following year for the LSTA Act. I don't know that there's going to be any more CARES Act funding for next year. We haven't heard anything from IMLS about that, but there definitely will be LSTA funding for next year. So, and again, reach out to us. Katie and Kayla have mentioned reach out to folks. We are happy to read applications and provide feedback. We're happy to help with ideas, activities. If you've got something in mind, but you're not quite sure how to move forward with it, Marianne Deeney, Claudia Holland, Amy Johnson, me, there are a lot of us, David Beach, we can give feedback. We've got a lot of folks who are very knowledgeable about different types of services. And so we can definitely help give some ideas, and also give some ideas on how to write your need, how to write your budget, how to provide information so that the LSTA panel reviewers will understand what you're saying. What Kayla said was extremely important. Realize that the folks that you're talking to may or may not know your community, may or may not know what you want to do. You know what you want to do, but they may not be able to read your mind. So make it very, very clear and very concise, and describe exactly what it is you want to do and how it's going to impact your communities. And definitely read the applications and follow instructions. That would be my biggest recommendation. So again, some additional resources. We've got a lot of information for both the CARES Act and the LSTA on our website. We've got the guidelines on our website. We've got instructions on our website. We've got contact information on our website, all of it right there at the dos.myflorida Library Archive Services for Libraries, Grant Cares. So anyway. So I'm gonna turn it back.
Well, thank you, Kayla and Katie and Dorothy, for all of that really thorough and excellent information. If there are any questions from anyone, please, as I mentioned, go ahead and you can type it into the chat, and we can start answering some questions. We have a few moments. We have one question here. What is the amount allowed to apply for the DLIS CARES program? So Dorothy, that's to you.
I don't believe we've put a cap on it. I know we had thought we were going to, but I don't believe we are going to have a cap on that. So we've got, for the CARES Act, we've got almost $2 million. It's $1,940,696 available, and I do not believe we're putting any type of cap on it. Only one application per eligible entity. So it's not like LSTA where you can put in as many as you want. You get one application. But as far as I can tell, that I remember, we have no cap on it. Just, it'd be a little rude to ask for all $2 million.
Okay, great. And can you remind everyone what the deadline was for the?
So August 17th, 2020 is the application deadline for the CARES Act. And the council will be reviewing it through the middle of September.
Perfect, great, thank you. All right, and we just have a couple more moments. So if you wanted to get your questions in, as I mentioned, we're recording this session and we will be sharing the slides as well. So you'll have all of those links and additional resources that our presenters have shared as well. I have one question, and that is sort of what are the big, when you're reviewing, and this goes to all of our panelists, what are some of the big red flags that you see when you're reviewing a proposal, when you say, okay, wait, you know, hold on, whatever it is. So I don't know who wants to take that question first.
I can, like Katie mentioned, like sometimes like investigating true collaborations. I also, it's pretty easy to tell when someone hasn't actually looked into best practices or done like research into what it would actually take to complete their project. And also just like Dolly reiterated, involving the beneficiaries of the project in the grant. So like actually determining the need and determining if it's going to be useful. So those I've seen some. It's pretty easy to tell when they haven't done that kind of background research or consideration or have had those conversations.
Great.
Yeah, I would second that. I also think in the second round, when grant applicants have ignored, or I've actually seen applicants fight with reviewers on their comments, that's not a good way to get a grant. I think listening for feedback, and if you don't understand or aren't happy with the feedback that's been given, certainly talking with program staff to work on it, but not simply ignoring it. And the other example, and I think Dolly wants to contribute on this one too, that I'll give quickly is in terms of digitizing materials in your collections that represent communities that aren't necessarily a dominant part of your organization or any part of your organization, making the effort to determine where descendants of those communities or where those communities might still exist is really important. And reaching out, not just about the sort of product of the grant, but reaching out about the potential connections and benefits and ways digitized material may be better incorporated into communities, I think is really important. I've read a few grants and gotten responses from groups, and the review committee has, where there's been just sort of an active dismissal of the relevance of the descendants of communities and others, and that's not going to get funded, and it's just not a good idea.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in. I know there have been council conversations about digitization grants where they have a list of the things they want to digitize, and they say, well, you know, if you look on the Internet Archive, it's already been done.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you all. We are just 2 minutes over time, but I think this was lots of incredible information that all of you have shared. So thank you again. And thank you to all our participants for joining us today and for listening in for all of this information.
Thanks everyone for being here.